Okay, thank you very much. Who else?
Yeah, I'd also like to,
Okay.
oh, sorry, just like to hear a little bit about some of the other frameworks that were mentioned as well. Aside from Scrum and Kanban, which I'm fairly familiar with, got some experience there, but yeah, and where it might be good to use those in other situations.
Same here. I've used Kanban and I like it, but I'd like to hear about other frameworks and when those would be helpful or appropriate. Thanks.
Thank you very much.
And the same for me as well. Just like to hear the different frameworks and where they are applicable.
Okay, so I think we're just gonna get started, and I see everybody wants to keep on with this. So Colleen, I'm gonna pass it off to you. Ladies and gentlemen, Colleen Johnson, the Pro Kanban CEO.
Thanks, Omar, and thanks to Andrea. I saw you join as well. Thanks for the invitation to be a part of this session today. I'm really excited to talk about this, and I want to preface this whole thing by saying this might be a slightly different format than you're anticipating. So we'll get into this and we'll ask a lot of questions. I'll pause a lot so we can talk about some of these different things, but I'm going to take a slightly different approach than talking just about frameworks, and we're going to talk about problems because that's really what we're here to do, right? To solve problems. I'll tell you a little bit about me. Let me get my slides opened up here. And do you see presenter view or do you see full slide?
Full slide.
Great. All right. Well, my name is Colleen Johnson. I live in Denver, Colorado. So I was just telling Omar that I want to go to Puerto Rico, and he was just telling me that he wants to come here to ski. So we want to trade places. Let me know if you want a house swap, Omar. I'm in. I've got a spot for you in Denver. I am the CEO of ProKanban.org, which is an inclusive learning community for Kanban practitioners, new and old, and from all different backgrounds. And so if you're interested in learning more about Kanban, I invite you to join us there and join our Slack community, which is where most of our conversations take place. Despite being a pro Kanban, the CEO of Pro Kanban, I am not going to tell you that all your problems will be solved by Kanban today. I did see that, I think, in one of the posts about this, that she'll say everything do Kanban. So we'll talk about some different approaches here. In my work, I am a transformation coach for Agile Velocity. And so I get to see a lot of different frameworks. I do a lot of Scrum coaching and training. I do a lot in SAFe. I see a lot of these different methods coming together as well. So I'll talk a lot about how I see this all work in real life through that coaching that I do. I'm also the co-founder of Scatterspoke, which is a tool for online retrospectives and much more. It's a really data-driven tool that allows teams to provide feedback asynchronously, so that when you get together to have your retrospective, all of your data is already there, and you can just have a great conversation with your team about what you want to improve on. I've been really involved in the Denver community in Agile Denver as chair of the 2016 and 2017 Mile High Agile conferences. Unfortunately, we haven't had one for the last couple of years due to COVID. I hope that makes a comeback soon because it's always a really vibrant place. And Omar, it's in May, so probably too late to ski, but not definitely too late to ski. So make your way out for that when that comes back. I was also a member of the Agile Uprising board for a few years. And if you are a podcast fan, I highly recommend the Agile Uprising podcast. Obviously, I'm biased, but it also gives you the ability to hear from a lot of different practitioners and a lot of different places and how people are applying different Agile methods. And one of the things I love the most about that podcast is it really challenges a lot of the things that we think about and where Agile is going to work or not work. So I'm always really excited, about some of the content that they're bringing into our space. My most important job is mama to three. I've got 3 kiddos. We're embarking on high school this year, which is terrifying for me. And we spend a lot of our time in the woods trying to camp and get out of the city as much as possible. So that is where I find my flow state, is trying to unplug as much as possible with my family. So let's go ahead and get started here. I'm going to pause as much as possible so that we can talk through some of these things as a group. I'm going to ask you guys questions and jump in. I invite everyone to share their thoughts and feedback as we go through these different things and talk about what we're trying to do to build great agile companies. So I want to start with this. We would never embark on building a new product with a solution, right? Or at least we would try to coach to not do that. Unfortunately, that often happens. So I don't know, is let's eat our own dog food a saying in the Bahamas? I know we have people from all over the world. Is this a familiar saying? No, Omar says no.
First time I heard it.
Okay. So when we say let's eat our own dog food, it means let's practice what we preach. Although I've heard somebody say also, you could say, let's drink our own champagne, which I like much better. So what we're saying here is when we would approach building a new product, we would coach a team to back away from just starting with a solution. We would say, what problems are we trying to solve, right? Who is our user? What other things has that user tried, right? And what's the desired end state that we're trying to achieve? We're trying to solve their problem and help them do something better, in particular, what are the different solutions that we could entertain here? And then, one of the things we often would work with from a product perspective is, how do we know that the solution we're providing to our customers is helping them do something better, right? What metrics are we going to use to evaluate whether or not the solution we've put in front of them is helping? So we would do all of these things if we were building a product, but I feel like we often forget them when we're trying to implement Agile, right? We start with the frameworks. And I heard, in hearing your questions, I think that's where our mind goes of what framework should I put into place here? So I want to pause and invite us all to take a step back tonight and think about this more from the perspective of what problem are we trying to solve with agility? And we're going to talk about this from a problem perspective first. We're going to look at a bunch of different problems we're trying to solve and then talk through the different practices, regardless of whether it's Scrum or Kanban or SAFe or any of the other frameworks mentioned, and talk about it from a practices perspective so that we can really look at what practices help us achieve the desired outcome that we have for our teams or for our organization. So what are some of the common problems? If we start high level here with the problems that I would say kind of bubble up for most organizations, high rates of turnover. And I think this has gone through such a crazy wave over the last 6 months, right? I feel like in the middle of COVID, we were seeing some of the highest rates of people quitting, and people not just quitting, but quitting with nowhere to go. Now we're seeing a slightly different trend in turnover in terms of we're starting to see more layoffs and companies making changes to their teams. So rates of turnover can be voluntary or involuntary, but it has a huge impact on our ability to deliver great products. Customer churn, I would say, falls into that very same bucket. So customer churn, when we think of that, it is, a combination of customers coming and going because there's new products available or new options available to them, but also as we're entering into some unknown financial territory, we're also starting to see that the way customers are spending money looks different, and that can be B2B, B2C. But if customer churn is high, then we as a business have a problem that we need to solve. Product defects are probably a common pain point for many of you in the software world. So we're looking at how do we solve the problem of just the quality of code that we're putting into production. And I think for a lot of organizations, Agile can be misconstrued as a method to try to get teams to deliver faster. And then it breaks some other things, right? It contradicts some of your other goals as an organization, and production defects can often be the side effect of that. Slow delivery times. So we see it with a lot of organizations, and I'm going to tell you some stories tonight about different projects I've been a part of where, we're plagued by the time that it takes us to get work out the door, and that can have a huge impact on our ability to satisfy our customers, right? Or to reduce that customer churn if we're not getting features to them quickly enough. Missed release dates is probably an hour-long talk all in and of itself. But when we talk about, setting dates in Agile, we have a tendency to, I don't know if I hear this as much anymore, but I feel like early in the Agile days, there was definitely a misconception that there are no dates in Agile. And there's actually a lot of dates in Agile and a lot of forecasting in Agile. But that doesn't mean that we hit all those dates correctly. And so that can be a big pain point for organizations, especially if those release dates get shared with customers or going out, and being published, or there's regulatory issues, right? If you're fined, if you miss a date, those release dates are really important to your business success. Changing priorities is a big one. And when we think about changing priorities, this can be a lot of different things depending on what part of the business you're looking at, right? So when we're thinking about product development teams, changing priorities might be pretty straightforward, right? Switching out features or talking about things like defects coming in or having to switch gears. But the other part of changing priorities can be on other parts of the business, right? So what impact does that have on marketing or sales or security, right? Priorities changing across all these different parts of the business can become really hard to manage. Unbalanced workloads is something I see a ton in our space. And when I think about unbalanced workloads, it's, despite all the things we try to do to build really great cross-functional teams, we may still have highly specialized teams, right? So we're moving away from highly specialized people, but we still have highly specialized teams. And that means that we may have one team that's super busy and another team that is sitting idle. And so how do we start to think about how we can balance those workloads across our organization so that we can deliver based on the highest value instead of based on which team is available and their specialization. And the status quo. And when we talk about the status quo, after years of being in the consulting side of Agile coaching, I think it's great to talk about how we want to change the way an organization does business. It's hard once you're there. And this isn't anyone's fault, but it's easy to fall back into old patterns and old ways of doing things because that's what we know. And that's, it's comfortable. And for so many teams and programs, portfolios, organizations, right, what we start to see is that we go in and we may start to change a few things based on a framework that we pick, but things fall back into our old way of doing things because we don't understand why we changed them in the first place. So let's talk about outcomes, right? This is a depressing list of problems. Let's talk about where we're trying to go or what things here we are trying to fix. So if we talk about this in terms of outcomes, we can really map each of these problems that I mentioned to a different thing that we're trying to achieve, right? Greater employee engagement, increased customer satisfaction, higher quality code, higher quality experiences, faster delivery, improved predictability, innovation in your products, market responsiveness, team productivity, and continuous improvement. So I'm going to use these outcomes as a way for us to talk about practices. And we're going to break this down to kind of the micro level practices separate from the framework. And I think that's going to be important as we move through this. But some of the practices that may be most familiar to you, and I heard multiple people say this in the introduction, are really Scrum and Kanban. And I think when we look across SAFe, less, DAD, I think I just read about another one today called, I think, FAST. There's all these scaling frameworks are really pulling from these core practices of Scrum and Kanban and blending them or using them at different levels of how they're applying Agile practices. I'm going to leverage both the Scrum guide and the Kanban guide for these conversations. And if you haven't read the Scrum guide from scrum.org or the Kanban guide from prokanban.org, they're great places to get started. Both guides get updated on I wouldn't say a time-based cadence, but they get updated as things change in our industry, which is important, right? If we're going to teach people how to change the way they work and adapt to how things around them change, I think it's important that we change our stance on some of these things too. So you'll see some of that guide language and recommendations change over time with the industry. So Scrum practices that we're all very familiar with are things like our product backlog or PBIs, product backlog items, right? Things that get prioritized by the product owner and come to the team through sprint planning. If you have read the guide, you know the term sprint commitment has changed to sprint goal. And so for the team, thinking about how to empower the team to plan their own work and set their own goal, and then organize around their work on a daily basis through their daily meeting or daily Scrum meeting. So all of these practices, right, are things that Scrum provides a cadence for and that we're doing on a regular basis, typically 2 weeks, but it can be more, it can be less. And then closing out that period with a sprint review, which includes a recap of how we did during our sprint. What did we commit to? What did we achieve? How far off were we, right, and what we hoped to get done? And then closing out with that sprint retrospective, right? So do these look familiar to everyone? Is anything here that's different from what you know to think of or what comes to mind for you for Scrum practices? I see some thumbs up. Looks familiar. Okay. All right. So let's talk Kanban practices. And it sounds like we have a decent amount of Kanban knowledge in the group, which is amazing. When we think about Kanban practices, we typically think about our work items. What are the different types of work that move through our team? We think about our definition of workflow. So how will work move from a backlog or a to-do column through the different steps to provide value to our customers. And part of that definition of workflow becomes, where does work start and where does work finish? And how do we know basically when to start the clock? When does our cycle time start, right? When we've committed to pulling that work into some state of our workflow. And then how do we know when it's done? So start and finish points probably sound very familiar to definition of ready and definition of done from a Scrum perspective, right? Workflow policies, you know, I've run into many times in my career where I've heard people say that they don't do Kanban because it's not strict, it doesn't have strict time boxes, or it doesn't have enough checkpoints as Scrum does. And I think without workflow policies, that can be very true. Workflow policies are really what has to be true for work to move from one stage of your workflow to the next. And when you think about those workflow policies, it's almost like a micro level definition of done. So what has to be true for something to move from a in development column to an in test column could be an example. WIP control can come in also many forms. So things like work in progress limits, visualizing your aging work on the board. So how old is this ticket that's on our board right now? Hopefully something more than the red dots in Jira, although I know that's what most of us have available to us if you're working in Jira. And as we start to look at this, from a Kanban perspective, if your container in Scrum is your sprint, right? That's your time box. Your container in Kanban is your service level expectation, or SLE as we refer to it. And that is a way for us to have a time box that we're pushing against at an individual work item level. So being able to say for our team, 85% of our work items will take 7 days or less. And then you as a team have a way to organize around the work and make sure that if something approaches 7 days or passes 7 days on your board, that you have a way to come together to clear that blocker or address that item that's aging. So Kanban practices and Scrum practices probably are starting to not sound that different after all, right? There's a lot of similarities in the ways that we're approaching things in terms of making policies clear and understanding when to start and when to finish work, and understanding how we're going to control a time box or have something to push against. Both practices and both approaches have those things in there. And I think that's an important place for us to start our conversation. I'm going to leverage something from Path to Agility here. And these cards are the Path to Agility defined business outcomes. I really like these because I think almost everything that we looked at from our list of business problems rolls up to essentially these different outcomes of what a business is trying to achieve. When I start any new coaching engagement or transformation effort, the first thing I do is I ask the organization to rank these and tell me what the top 3 business outcomes are that we're trying to achieve. And the funny part is I can't tell you how many times I've had a an executive say, this seems like a trick question. Aren't they all important? Or can't we make them all number one? And what the takeaway here is while they might all be important, some of them are going to contradict each other, right? I mentioned maybe quality and speed might be at odds, or employee engagement and speed may be at odds, right? So there's different things here that when we start to think about what's going to be important to us as a business, might not work together in the way that we want them to. And so what I like to do is start with, what are we trying to do? Why do you want to be agile? Why do you have me here? And at the end of the day, if you were to say agile is a success for our organization, what does that look like? And so if you look at these cards, and we're going to go through them all in a little more detail, there's nothing on them that says anything about any agile practice, right? But from a business perspective, these make sense, right? We want to be more predictable. We want to be more productive with our teams, right? And so all of these things are going to be what we're going to focus on over picking a specific framework. So I want to start with employee engagement. And so employee engagement means employees are satisfied, more satisfied in their work, willing to go the extra mile, passionate about the purpose of their jobs, and committed to their organization. So let's talk about this. For those of you in a software job right now, I'm curious if anyone has been part of what Melissa Perry would refer to as a feature factory, where we're just cranking out things as fast as we can. Or, I think another new trend is measuring developer output, right? So developer metrics around how quickly are we delivering things into production. And that can tell you one part about your business and how effective you may be or productive you may be, but it may be breaking this, right? Which is how engaged are your employees? And I mentioned, this what we're referring to as the Great Resignation of employees quitting in record numbers. And I had an amazing opportunity to be part of an interview for our Kanban for Everyone series, where we got to interview some teachers applying Kanban and Scrum practices inside the classroom. And one of the most amazing parts of the whole interview was that they really addressed that so many teachers are quitting right now and just not returning to the profession. They're leaving it altogether. So it's not that they're going to find a new teaching job in a different county, in a different state. They're just not coming back. And when you think about teaching, I think this is also happening in a lot of other industries in the world right now. And so if people are quitting and not coming back, we have an engagement problem, right? And how do we get them excited about the work that we're doing? In that interview, one of my favorite parts that they talked about was how do we give the people that we're working with the ability to organize around their work? And in their case, it was students. So how do we give the students the autonomy to organize around their work and say, here's what we want to work on next, or we want to spend more time thinking about this environment. So when we think about employee engagement, I think there's a couple practices that really come to light here. One of the first things I think that builds incredible employee engagement is getting teams involved in discovery. And so any organization where you have that feature factory mentality, right, where product goes off and develops all the user stories and drops them over the wall to the dev team becomes really disconnected from what they're building. And I've seen this work well, and I've seen it work horribly. So it's so important that we start to get the teams involved in what they're going to be building. And so that means getting teams involved in things like story mapping activities, or getting them involved in discovery exercises so that they can really be part of understanding what problem they're going to solve, not just cranking out stories as quickly as they can. I think both Kanban and Scrum do this well, and it's really, to me, more about your upstream practices. Neither model or neither practice or approach is really prescriptive in how you organize your work, right? It's all about the team level practices. And so if you want to think about how you involve teams in these discovery practices, you really have to take a step back and think about things more at the program or portfolio level. And I'll use that terminology from a scaled agile perspective, and SAFe defines a program as a team of teams and a portfolio as a group of programs together as a way to scale these practices. But what becomes really important here is that we're getting teams involved in problem solving. You spend a lot of time and money to hire brilliant people. So getting them really close to what problem they're going to be solving becomes critical to their engagement. The second here is bringing the work to the team. And so has anybody heard that phrase before? Bring the work to the team rather than the team to the work? See a couple thumbs up. What we mean by bring the work to the team versus the team to the work is when we think back to old ways of doing project management, we might say, we have this thing to build. We have this widget to build, and it's going to take 5 days of Alice's time at 20% capacity over the next couple of weeks, and it's going to take 8 days of Omar's time over the next couple of weeks at 40% capacity, and we build out this really beautiful Gantt chart. So we're trying to figure out everybody's allocation that needs to contribute to that project. When we think about bringing the work to the team, it means that the team stays together, and when they have capacity for the next item, we're going to bring work to them. And so when we think about that model, and I see Kevin posted in the chat here, it requires T-shaped skills, and it really does, and that takes time to develop, but it helps break down those silos in your organization where you have high levels of specialty. So what we're trying to do there is bring the work to the team and say, as a team, you're going to organize around this work together and figure out what's required to get it done. And that may sound a lot like sprint planning, right? And so giving the team that opportunity to see the work coming to them and organize around it instead of trying to reorganize people every time there's something new to work on starts to create team engagement too on a different level than just the employee. And the third one here is giving the team the autonomy to make changes. And man, I wish I had taken a screenshot of this today, because I just saw a thread in LinkedIn today of someone talking about this, how whenever there's a big agile transformation effort, everyone comes in with their book and all the things, a book and a checklist of all the things that have to be true for us to say that we're doing agile. And we even have assessments, right, to hold ourselves to it. So we'll check in every quarter and assess whether or not you're doing these 10 things to determine if you're an A, B, or C level of your agility, right? And so I think one of the things that becomes really important when we think about this part is the teams know how they're working, and they know what problems are taking place for them as they try to deliver. And so giving the team the autonomy to make the changes they need to their process becomes really important. And as a Scrum Master and as a coach, this can sometimes mean that the team makes changes to the way that they're working that we wouldn't recommend or that we wouldn't really want them to make. And I think that's even more important, that you let the team do the things that they want to try, frame it as an experiment so that they have a chance to see how it's going to work and see if they want to continue with that change. We'll talk a little bit about retrospectives, but that's a great place for that practice to come out. But without that autonomy, the teams are just, I think, kind of blindly going through these patterns without thinking about what it's doing for them. So a few practices here. I think you can see some of them in Scrum and some of them in Kanban. And I think, you'll probably see a pattern here that I'm going to blend a lot of these different things together. So let's talk, any comments on employee engagement? Does anybody want to talk about anything they see as a great way to foster employee engagement before we move to the next?
I guess I'll put something that I'll add to what Kevin says. If you don't have that trust or create that trust with employees, there's no way you're going to have that engagement. It's just not going to happen.
Yep, I totally agree.
And I'll probably add a note to that too. Transparency with employees is #1 point of engagement too.
Yeah, great call out. Yeah, and I think, if we're trying to map these back to different ways of achieving transparency, I think both Kanban and Scrum can do that. To me, almost thinking there is more about access to the information than it is about the method of conveying information. So, we've moved to a world where it's very difficult to have physical boards anymore. But so if all your boards live in Jira or Miro or all these different places, how do we create transparency in that information, right, to help build that trust? So it's like getting access to those tools where the information lives becomes imperative. All right, let's talk about customer satisfaction. So from the path to agility definition, customers are satisfied with the experience, benefits, and outcomes when using your service. Seems pretty straightforward, right? That we have satisfied customers. I like to share this story. I know there's a few people, names I recognize who've probably heard me tell this story 100 times now, but it's such a good reminder of why we do what we do. I worked for a web and audio conferencing company in the, I don't know, early 2000s. And it was it was kind of Zoom before Zoom, but not as cool, not as robust, I should say. It was a cool place to work. But when we kept getting calls from our customers that were asking for the ability to play back a clip of a video in their talk. So if I'm giving you this talk, I could play a video and pause it and talk over it and play a little bit more, and audio and video would stay in sync for all of us since we're all watching this together. So we said, great, we're going to get a team of all of our best engineers together to go tackle this problem. We gave it a sexy name. We called it video clip playback. And we spent about 18 months developing this feature. And halfway through that whole effort, we Flash support changed and we had to start all over. And then we had this whole method of you got a token and you would upload your video with the token. And so fast forward to the end of this project, which we were using Scrum. We were working in 2-week sprints. And we got to the end and we had a huge party, and we had a waffle bar where you could cook bacon into your waffles, and we had hats and shirts printed, and everybody celebrated the release of video clip playback. And no one used it, not one person. So we reached out to customer support and we said, hey, could you call some people and ask why, they asked for this and now they're not using it. We spent a lot of time and money building it. And as they started to call people, one of the things they started to report back on was that this isn't what they wanted. This isn't what they were asking for. They were asking for the ability, if I have a video of the presentation I've given, so like your Zoom recording, to take a clip from that video and play that back in your presentation. So we missed the mark in a pretty epic way. And what's important about that is we could have probably solved that problem by doing a few things. I think the first is breaking the work down small so that you can get feedback sooner. Part of what you're trying to do from a Scrum perspective is get things in front of your stakeholders so they can tell you yes or no. That's what I like. That's what I don't like. Instead of waiting, even working in Scrum and then waiting 18 months to deploy something is not going to help you learn quickly. And I think part of that is making learning a priority. So, it's when we think about how to break up work and how we break up our features or our epics, we tend to think about them in terms of how we're going to build things. So even if we're doing MVP, it's like an MVP style approach. It's like epic 1, epic 2, epic 3, instead of what could I put out in front of a customer that's going to help me decide what to keep building next. And if you can adjust the way you're thinking about how you're delivering and breaking up your work so that learning is the priority, then you're going to get feedback more quickly so that you know if you're on the right track or not. And then the last one here is success metrics. So tracking success metrics is going to really start to help you know and quantify if you're on the right track or not. And those success metrics can really help you pick what the next thing is that you want to work on and focus on when you're done with something. So instead of planning out a huge release, you can plan these small batches of work that you're going to deliver. And when you're done because you've achieved success through that data-driven metric that you've set. When we think about how all of these things come together, there's not a lot of framework here, right? Does anybody see anything that feels frameworky? I don't. I think breaking work down small is a best practice, whether you're doing Scrum or Kanban. Making learning a priority to me really comes to how we're breaking down our work before we ever start writing user stories. And tracking success metrics, I think, is an important part of that work breakdown structure. And you can think about whether that goes into your workflow on a Kanban board where you're pausing to learn and measure, or whether you're using that in something like a release planning or a PI planning event in Scaled Agile if all your teams are doing Scrum. So a lot here that is really framework agnostic, but practices that are going to help you achieve customer satisfaction. Does anybody want to share any thoughts or stories of their own for customer satisfaction? Oh, I see. Kevin said, love to hear work breakdown structure in an agile discussion. I do too. I think a side rant on work breakdown structure for you, Kevin. I think, no matter what practices you're doing, whether you're doing Scrum or Kanban or any of the other scaling frameworks, you can be doing it by the book. If your work isn't broken down in a way that enables you to deliver incrementally and get feedback quickly, none of these practices really matter at all. So +1 to your comment. All right, let's talk about quality. I started out my career in QA in waterfall environments. So I spent 9 to 10 months out of the year playing ping pong, and the other 2 months frantically trying to test these massive releases and living off coffee and being at the office till midnight trying to get things out the door. So I think that's probably why I love Agile so much. So when we talk about quality, it means that the product or service meets the expectations of the market for usability and reliability. And, when we think about quality, right, we tend to think about quality as a role. And really what we're trying to do with Agile and building Agile teams is make quality the team's responsibility. And this is really hard. I do think in this case that Kanban does do a better job of this than Scrum in my mind, but I think this really comes down to the team itself. I think WIP limits, whether you can have WIP limits on a Scrum board, and that's where I think starting to think about how to balance the workload really comes together here. In a lot of organizations, what we see is we work in 2-week sprints, and the developers may start all the work at the same time, and they're working really hard on all these stories, and then 2 days before the sprint, all of it gets dumped on QA. And so QA is trying to catch up, trying to clear that backlog for the team and get everything done so they can deliver on time for the end of the sprint. And so when we put WIP limits in place, it means that we have to pull the work. And so dev can't keep working as fast as they want until QA has capacity to pull the next item. And that's such an important way to balance the work around the team. And I think it's just frankly very respectful to say we don't prioritize development work over QA work, that we're going to balance this out and say that you can't keep working as fast as you can at the detriment of somebody else on the team. So I think WIP limits are really great here, and you can absolutely use WIP limits in your Scrum teams as well. A lot of our lean practices come from manufacturing, and on the manufacturing floor, there's something called an and-on cord, which means if all these little widgets are going by and one of them's not working or is messed up, you pull the cord and you stop the line. And I think that's really important too, in terms of respecting the role that quality has in how we deliver great products. And it's that ability to stop the line. So instead of saying we're either blocked or there's an issue with what we're working on, and then have the rest of the team keep cranking out code, stop the line and have everyone get involved. And that's really number 3 here, that quality is everyone's job. Now, one of the biggest questions I always get when we talk about WIP limits and making quality everyone's job is I'll often hear the developers say, well, you want me to stop working? You just want me to stop writing code? And the answer is, yeah, I do. I want you to stop writing new code. Before I ever got involved in software, I worked in restaurants, and in the back of the restaurants, there's often a sign in the back that says, if you can lean, you can clean. And that's what I always tell the developers. I'm not asking you to not do anything or go play ping pong. I'm just asking you to stop pulling in new work that's going to add to a growing backlog that we're not going to be able to clear out. And so what else could you do to contribute to the health of the team? It might be research. It might be reading stories in the backlog. It might be writing unit tests, but all I'm asking is that you don't pull in new work. And so when we start to think about how quality is everyone's job, it really becomes around how do we handle an imbalance of work so that we can get work done sooner. Any thoughts or feedback on quality? Any other QA folks out there? Or anybody else really good at ping pong? All right, let's talk about speed. So I mentioned at the beginning, I hear a lot that a lot of organizations will say that they're trying to to get faster with Agile. They want to deliver faster. And when we think about speed, what we mean here is the time that it takes to deliver an idea into the market that meets the expectations of the customers. And so there's a few things that are important when we start to think about how we work faster. I'm going to go back to what Kevin said about work breakdown structure. A lot of times we talk about how you can game the system a little bit with your velocity or different metrics that you're using, whether it's story points or throughput or cycle time. But really what matters far more than that metric is making sure that what the work is that you're putting into production is actually done, right? So I'm working with a client right now where they create a separate story for development than they do for QA effort. And so counting the stories that I've delivered that the dev team has closed actually doesn't tell me anything about how fast we're delivering value to the market because they haven't been tested or deployed yet. So again, work breakdown structure becomes critical here to understanding how fast we are at delivering value. Again, I'm going to lean a little bit on some flow metrics here and flow metrics that you could use with Kanban or Scrum. So I think the first thing to know about speed is you probably already have a ton of data you could use. And when I say the data you can use, I mean cycle time data and throughput data. If you've been running Scrum, if you've been running Kanban, even if you've been running in a waterfall environment, you can start to leverage this data to tell you how you're working and help you forecast how to deliver on time. And part of this becomes knowing your service level expectation. So I mentioned this at the beginning, and I think this is such a powerful tool for any development team. Your SLE becomes kind of your internal, oh crap number, like, oh crap, we're almost to 7 days, we need to do something. And it's a way for you as a team to say, it's time for us to take a different action. What we're doing right now is not working. One of the things I hear a lot from dev teams and dev organizations is that they don't feel like they have control over their dates. And we'll talk about predictability in a minute and setting better dates. But once a date is set, what control do we have over achieving that date? We're just writing code, right? Making your SLE a team sport and something that the team can engage in setting based on that past data gives the team the tool to see when things are going off the rails, and it gives the team the tools to organize around their work on their own. That doesn't work without number 3, which is you have to be able to see how old the tickets are on your board. And I'll be very honest with you, there aren't a lot of tools that do this well. I worked with one group where we just wrote the date that development started on the front of the description of every ticket. And so when you looked at the board, the first thing you saw was the date. So we could organize our stand-up around the oldest dates on the board. And that becomes really helpful for us to say, oh, it looks like this ticket is more than 8 days old or whatever the SLE is. What are we going to do? And I saw swarming on the chat earlier, but maybe we're going to swarm it. Maybe we're going to split the ticket up. Maybe this isn't getting worked anymore and we're going to abandon the work. But having a policy around what your SLE is and how to make that work item age visible starts to make things move faster, right? Because even if we're all working and we're all busy, chances are that there's work on the board that's not getting touched and it's sitting idle. And so being able to see those things quickly and address them is going to speed everything in your system up. Sounds a lot like flow metrics and Scrum teams, or flow metrics for Kanban teams, for both. Any thoughts on speed? Is everybody eating dinner? All right, let's talk predictability. So when we talk about predictability, we mean that teams maintain a predictable cadence of delivery, enabling the business to make informed decisions. So I mentioned earlier, dates always tend to get kind of bad-mouthed in Agile, that we can't have dates and that things change. And I think what the difference here is, you can have dates, but maybe what we're delivering is changing, right? And so when we talk about how we're going to forecast work, we want to think about, what are we doing? Are we forecasting a release? Are we forecasting a fixed number of work items? And there's multiple different ways we can start to think about how we deliver predictably. But a few things need to be true before thinking about setting good dates is going to matter. And so when we think about predictability, there's a couple things we need to think about. Small batch size is really important. And so when we tend to try to forecast things, we might say, oh, we have this huge project and it has, 4 features in it, and each feature has, 20 stories in it. And So we're going to try to forecast this whole thing. Well, if you think about Scrum practices, there's a reason that in Scrum, you break all your work down all the way down into subtasks so that you can estimate your subtasks in hours. It's because that's the smallest unit of work and the most concrete unit of work. And so when we get things nice and small, there's less unknowns. The same is true when we're trying to forecast work and dates. So if we can get our small batch size, meaning a small feature, a small epic, to be as small as possible, there's just going to be less unknowns and less room for, variation or change in that number. But what's important here is number 2, and that is this concept of continuously reforecasting. And so when we start to think about how we forecast our work, we tend to set a date and never change it, right? Regardless of the pace of the team, the size of the team, the size of the scope, especially, right? I think that's one of the things we probably hear the most is the scope increased or the scope changed, but the date stayed the same. Part of what we need to do from an agile perspective is reforecast as we get new information. But one of the things that can be really important when we think about reforecasting is how we communicate that to stakeholders. I see a lot of teams where they learn how to run a Monte Carlo simulation and reforecast their dates based on their throughput. And then what happens is the date of every deliverable changes every couple days. So it's like, now it's August 31st. Now it's September 6th. Now it's, September 30th. Now it's September 15th. And stakeholders are like, what are you doing? Right? What's happening that these dates keep changing? They get their heads spin. So what we want to think about when we think about how we get predictable is how do we identify those places where it's causing a lot of churn or change in our data? And then how do we communicate that in a way that we're looking at risk and at the probability of hitting that date? And so a great way to do that is to keep your date as you're communicating to stakeholders and say things like, our likelihood of hitting September 6th is now at 30% instead of 80%. And here's why. So reforecasting, we'll have to have another talk. We'll pull Andrea in and have her help us talk about forecasting dates. It's a great topic and I really love talking about it. But when we want to think about predictability, we have to really take into account the changes that come to a team. The last one here is the same as the last slide, make that work item age visible. So if we're trying to be predictable, we have to really make sure that we're always looking at how long things are taking when they're in progress, not just when they're done. I like to always say the most expensive place to test an idea is in production, right? But it's also by the time we have the data around cycle time, something's already done. And so it's too late to take action on that item. Work item age is data that gives us the ability to respond and act and do something with it. And so when we think about work item age, it's giving us that ability to do something with that data. All right, let's talk about innovation. So new ideas, creative thoughts, or novel imaginations provide better solutions to meet new requirements, unarticulated needs, or known market needs. So when we talk about innovation, I think Scrum, Kanban, a lot of these practices are going to enable you to do this with the caveat of a lot of the things that we've already talked about, right? So batch size is going to come into play here. I think one of the things that I see fall down the most for organizations that are really prioritizing innovation is the concept of roadmaps. And I've done a few talks on roadmaps, and I think it's such an interesting pattern that has stayed in our lives, even though we've been doing Agile for 20 plus years. Agile's been around disrupting the market. We still plan out releases with these Gantt charts and 2 years out of what features we're going to deliver. And I think a great way to start to turn that on its head is the concept of options versus plans. And so we talked a little bit about success metrics. And so if you think about how you can leverage the data coming out of what you've deployed, looking at options versus having a serialized number of things that you're going to deploy becomes really valuable. It's kind of like a choose your own product adventure at that point. But one of the things I like to think about here is we may go through, like if I use the example of a gift card, like if I asked everybody, we're going to add a new feature and you can donate the remainder of your gift card balance to the charity of your choice. And everybody said, oh, that's a great idea. There's always like a weird dollar left on there that I can't use. I'd rather have it go to a charity. And I say, great. Okay. we're going to put this in our backlog and it's going to be the next feature we're going to pull. Well, maybe one of the features we deployed before was to introduce the ability to pay with Apple Pay. And at that time, we also introduced some metrics gathering on different payment methods. And we find out that less than 10% of our customers pay with gift cards. Would that still be the feature we would want to build next? Probably not. I mean, it's still a cool idea. I still love the concept, but probably not worth the investment right now. And so if we look at our backlog of features and epics more as options instead of fixed plans, it gives us the ability to pivot more easily. And this is super important these days with COVID still lingering and all the changes in our world. We have to be able to pick the next highest priority thing when we have the capacity to pull it rather than try to plan out years in advance. This requires that you have great pull criteria, and pull criteria, I'm going to borrow that term from Kanban, and it's also known as your policies, right? Your pull policies. Know how you're going to pick what's next. We tend to pick from the plan. We tend to pick from the next thing in the backlog. But if we think about this more around what has to be true when we go to pull new work, it might be things like customer demand, market demand, what has changed in the market to pick this next item that we're going to pull across, what team has capacity to do the work, right? So how do we start to have a more quantitative look at what thing we're going to pull from that backlog of ideas? That also requires that you have one feature backlog or one epic backlog rather than a separate one for each team, which is also a challenging concept. And you've probably heard the term get outside the building. Innovation can't take place when we all stay inside. And, there's no shortage of ideas in any organization. So it means that we have to go talk to people to learn more about what they want. All right, let's talk about market responsiveness. This is the ability of the organization to pivot quickly to respond to ever-changing market demands. So when I think about this, I think a lot about what we've done with Scatterspoke. And, I mentioned that Scatterspoke is an online retrospective tool. And, at the beginning of COVID, when everybody had to go home and work from home and do everything online, we were like, we just won the lottery, right? Everybody's going to need an online retrospective tool. Well, they did, but it turns out every big company also launched a retrospective tool. So Miro, Mural, everything had a retro tool in it now. And so we had to pause and say, what is something that we have that all of these big businesses don't have, right? Because we're still small. And the answer for us was data. We had hundreds and hundreds of thousands of retrospective cards that teams had added about what they were trying to improve on. And so we were able to leverage machine learning that we trained against all of that data to start to generate reports about what was happening in retrospectives across organizations, because we could train the AI against all that data we had. So we were able to take changing market and changing climate around retrospective tools and try to do something different. But we couldn't have done that with a giant roadmap of things. So what I like to think about when we're talking about market responsiveness is what I call a feature taco. I lived in Chile in South America for a while when I was in college, and the traffic there was atrocious, and they call the traffic jams a taco, because it's packed so tight, no cars can merge in. And this is exactly how we plan our roadmaps. We pack our features so tight that there's no room to change direction. So if we want to be able to pivot quickly, we have to avoid a feature taco and make sure that we're always creating some space for us to change direction. It also requires that we minimize the amount of work we have in progress. So if we have a ton of stuff happening, it makes it really hard to change direction. So minimizing WIP at the feature and epic level becomes really important. And we have to embrace that we're going to change directions frequently. I think that's a very hard organizational shift to make. Most organizations actively avoid change. And so one of the things we have to get good at is change and embracing that we don't know what we're going to work on next. And I think what's interesting about all of this, right, is there's no product role explicitly in Kanban and technically no planning activities there. But what we're basically getting at here is how do we leverage some of the Kanban practices around minimizing WIP so that we can pick just in time what we're going to work on, whether you're doing Scrum or Kanban at the team level. All right, so let's talk about productivity. And this is increasing the business value realized while maintaining or reducing costs. Probably one of the things that gives me the most anxiety when I'm working with product organizations is when I hear the product owners say that they have to keep their team busy. Has anybody else heard a product owner say that? I have to keep my team busy. So when we think about what we're trying to do with a team is increase business value, right? And so we're not trying to just keep developers busy. We're trying to make sure that we're focusing on delivering value. And the first part that has to be true for that to take place is we have to stop trying to focus on individual utilization. This is a hard pattern to break out of, and I see it with Scrum and with Kanban that Scrum teams may do individual capacity allocation by the hour and say, well, Maria has capacity this week of 64 hours and she only has 40 in tasks, so we need to load her up to 100% capacity. Or I've seen it also with story points, right? Or individual WIP limits on a Kanban board. And as soon as we start to focus on that individual allocation and the individual utilization, it starts to contradict our ability to deliver as a team. If we want to focus on value and getting value out the door, that's a team sport. And that means we have to focus on team delivery versus trying to keep everybody busy. It also means that concept of organizing around the work. So making sure that we know how much work is coming to the team and giving the team the autonomy to organize around that work to be done. Another term that I have fully made up is this concept of ticket squatting, and it carries over nicely to think about WIP limits. But what I see for a lot of teams is one person will pull a bunch of tickets in and assign them all to themselves. And there's really no way on earth that they're working on all of those things at the same time, but it makes it hard for the rest of the team to contribute. And so one of the things we want to do when we're thinking about productivity is how do we start to share the work so that it's not just one person with all the tickets assigned to them. I worked with one team where we took the owners off the tickets in Jira so that when we did stand up, we would walk the board and we would talk about what was in flight, but we really had to listen to each other and listen to who was working on what and who needed help on a certain ticket because there were no owners anymore. It was a kind of a fun way to eliminate that ticket squatting. All right, let's talk about continuous improvement. We're at the home stretch here. So when we think of continuous improvement, this is the ability of the organization to relentlessly pursue optimizations in all business functions. And so this is where what retrospectives come into play, right? And we tend to think of retrospectives as a Scrum only event. And for a lot of teams, whether it's Scrum or Kanban, we run retros over and over and over, and nothing really changes. We tend to have a lot of the same conversations. Nothing's getting better. And I think there's a few key things that you can do. And retros are 100% part of Kanban too. We're always looking to optimize how we're working. So that concept of continuous improvement is present in really every framework I can think of. But what makes it work? What makes continuous improvement actionable and important and gives us evidence that it's valuable? I think the first thing is anchoring in data. And so we tend to spend a lot of time when we're in retros talking about how things went, and we end up with this whole list of how everybody feels. And while the feelings are really important, so is the data to tell us how we're working. And so I think that connection of the quantitative and qualitative sides of how a team is working and having that come together are really critical to having great retros and helping you identify what the right things are for you to focus on as a team. The second here is that action items should be experiments. And when we think about our action items, they are often this binary list of tasks, like make sure QA is invited to sprint planning. And then we get in the next retro and we're like, hey, did anybody invite QA to sprint planning? Yes. Okay, that action item's done. But what was it supposed to help us improve? Why do we want QA and sprint planning? And so if we can think about our action items as we need to make sure QA is involved in sprint planning because of this thing and this reason, and here's how we'll know, here's how we'll be able to tell that having them in sprint planning has improved the way that we're story pointing, or the amount of work that we're pulling in, or our the amount of commitment to planned work versus delivered work is improving, right? So how will we know that that's giving us the desired results? And so try to take your action items a step further into that experiment versus just a task to be done. And the last one here is have improvement goals. I think we think about continuous improvement just as being those action items for the team and making sure that we're creating those action items, but they often don't connect back up to a larger goal that we're trying to achieve. So know what your team is working on improving, and then use those action items as a small experiments that you can run to show that you're getting there. Again, nothing here framework specific. These all work whether you're doing any of the frameworks we talked about at the beginning. Okay, so that was a lot of information. I'll make sure you get these slides from Omar and Andrea, but I want to recap a little and then we'll open this up for questions. So the first thing, before picking a framework, before even trying to evaluate whether you're going to do Scrum or Kanban, because you can blend them together, is to say, what are we trying to do as a team? And that's a great, you can use the outcomes I presented here with your team as a survey and say, or at organizational level to say, what are we trying to do? What is our goal with these agile practices? And then focus on a few. Don't pick 10, don't pick 6, get 1 or 2 outcomes where you can say, these are the things that are most important to us. Innovation and speed are the things that we want to focus on. Customer satisfaction and employee engagement are the things we want to focus on. So know what those things are. And then start to create some flexibility at the team level so that all the teams can pick the practices that they believe are going to help enable them to achieve that outcome. One team may say, we're going to do Kanban by the book. Another team may say, we're going to do Scrum by the book. And I think that's great. I think you're going to get a lot more engagement from your teams if you give them the autonomy to pick the flavor of ice cream that's going to suit them best. That autonomy is going to give you that engagement at the team level that you're looking for. Share success and failures across the organization. And this can be hard. I see a lot of organizations that love to share success, but no one talks about what didn't go well. And we learn so much from those failures. In fact, that story I told about the video clip feature, I was in a group at that organization of people who were trying to start public speaking. And we had a practice group with the CEO in it. And I was trying to tell a story about learning from failures. And he said, why don't you just share the story? I don't know if he would like how many times I've told it at this point, but he gave me permission to share that failure because he said so many people will learn from what we didn't learn there. And the last one here is make sure you're creating alignment to those outcomes. So how are you measuring progress against the outcomes? The goal here isn't to do a checklist of Scrum practices. The goal is not to do a checklist of Kanban practices. And those practices are going to change over time, and they should evolve. But our goal here is how are we doing in delivering those outcomes and the business value. So look at Agile as this a la carte menu. You can pick things here, right? We can have WIP limits on a Scrum board. Ask Andrea, she'll help you. And then we can also do great retrospectives with the Kanban team. We can have flow metrics as part of our sprint review, and we can do sprint planning with really strict pull criteria, right? Or even PI planning with pull criteria. And it's not going to be the same. So your organization may need something different, and your teams may need something different from other teams in your organization. So invite that flexibility so everybody's finding the practices that fit. It's easy to say all this. And I think, unfortunately, what happens when we go to put this into practice is that we all know one best way of doing things, right? I'll see a team that says, we don't do Kanban because there's no time boxes, or we don't like Scrum because we don't like stand-ups. Having the ability to pick different practices starts with education. So start by educating yourself. I highly recommend the guides I mentioned at the beginning. Understand what the practices are for, not just the practice itself. So understand why that practice exists. So that way you can help guide your teams to whether or not it's the right fit for what they're trying to achieve. Run a lot of experiments. So when I'm working with new teams, I tell them, I give them a lot of autonomy. I give them a lot of autonomy to fail. And I'll say, I had one team that I was working with that was new to Kanban, and they said, we want to set our WIP limits at 30 per person. And I was like, oh my gosh. Okay. I was like, oh God, it goes against everything I was supposed to be coaching this team to do. But okay, let's try it. I said, let's try it for 2 weeks, and we'll check in at the retro. And I want to talk about what you expect to see at that stand-up or at that retro, and if it's giving you the results you wanted. And as you can imagine, it didn't, but giving them the autonomy to try the thing they wanted really helps them learn what works and what doesn't work. So give your team a lot of opportunity to try and fail and try and succeed and find the right fit. And I'll close out with this quote that I couldn't find who said, but change is inevitable, growth is optional. So if your practices look the same now as they did when you first implemented your agile practices a year ago, that's a great sign that it's time to come back and figure out what opportunities your teams have to grow and try something different. So that's everything I have for you all. I want to open it up and see if anybody has any questions, and I'm going to close the presentation. So if you want to share your video as you ask questions, I would love to see your face.
Before, I know there was a question that somebody posted earlier.
No one's speaking because you've astounded us with your wisdom.
Oh, there was one question that Kevin made, and he says, "I hear about frameworks everywhere. Is that limited to to role, responsibility, and event? That seems more leadership roles and leadership governance."
Yeah, I mean, I think you can boil it down to that. I think Scrum refers to it as events, artifacts, and roles, right? And in Kanban, there's, I would say, policies, practices and policies you're trying to put into place. But I think, you know, as you go up the ladder, when we think about some like Scaled Agile framework is a very rigid framework in a lot of ways in terms of what it's recommending. I think the most successful implementations I've seen of Scaled Agile framework are very a la carte. It's like, we're going to do a little big room planning, but we're not going to do any of this, or we're going to shorten our release trains to be every 6 weeks, because that's what makes the most sense for our business. And I think with all of these things, you have to challenge them. There's concepts there that are great, but really making them work for your organization and your business is the only way they're ever going to stick and provide value. So.
Now, one other question, and this is on my behalf. Somebody posted that they are aware of 383 different frameworks or practices. Aside from Scrum and Kanban, have you used any of the other frameworks that are out there?
I've run into some of the practices of less. And I wish I could remember the one I saw today online. I had not seen that one in practice yet. I think it was called FAST. But I think that there are, you know, I think when we think about all these different frameworks, we really have to try to understand what they're trying to achieve too, right? The frameworks have an outcome, and the frameworks have something they're trying to help you be better at. And so that's where that alignment back to your problem, the problem you're trying to solve for your team, is super important. I have not heard of that many different frameworks, but I think if you start combining all these different things together, I'm sure you could come up with 387 different flavors of all the combinations of practices when we mix them all together.
Hello, I have a quick question. Great presentation, by the way. I missed maybe the first half of it, but I wanted to ask, is it possible to use one of the agile frameworks and combine that with waterfall for a project that you're not really sure how it's going to go just yet, you know?
That's a great question. You know, I think probably one of the things a lot of what we're trying to achieve with Agile almost breaks waterfall in some ways, right? Of trying to get that feedback as quickly as possible and bring the team together to deliver. You know, I think if you go through that process of trying to prioritize your outcomes, you'd probably find the practices that you could bring into a waterfall setting without going completely away from waterfall.
Right.
That example, and you may not have been on yet, Olu, but the example I shared of that project that took 18 months, I mean, we were running Scrum, but we never delivered anything or put anything in front of customers for a year and a half. And so in a lot of ways, it was waterfall. but we were running sprints. You know, we were working incrementally, but not delivering anything. And so I think there are ways that you can do that, but it kind of depends on what outcome you're driving to. If you're looking for speed, that might be a faster way to deliver because you're working in small increments. But if you're looking for alignment and customer satisfaction, that didn't work for customer satisfaction. Yeah. So I think thinking about like, and if you're working on a waterfall project now, I would probably look at those business outcomes and say, what's one thing that we can improve about how we're working in a waterfall environment, and then pick 1 or 2 practices to add to that. It could be doing retrospectives, right? It could be that we're gonna do a retro every 2 weeks during our waterfall project and try to make sure that we're revisiting our metrics or revisiting our requirements. So I think you could definitely start to pull some of those practices in. I would just pick the one that feels the most, pick the practices based on what you're trying to achieve.
Right. And based on how things are going currently.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. Good advice. Thank you so much.
Yeah. Well, Andrea said it's time for a picture. That sounds like a lot of fun.
Yes, I am just right now posting our LinkedIn profiles for anybody who wants to connect with any of us. Additional to that, I've seen many people write to me personally and also posted in the chat, where can the recording of this session be? And I just added the link to our YouTube channel. So whoever wants to connect with us or see previous recordings and this one that will be posted in the future, there you can look us up. Now, for those who are still here, thank you for still being here with us. If you can, please turn on your camera so I can go ahead and take a picture and post this up on LinkedIn.
You've got a big group. How are you going to fit everybody, Omar? You must have a giant monitor.
Actually, I'm going to switch monitors to try to get everybody, but if not, I'll just take two different shots.
Don't worry, he's got skills.
Okay, so here we go.
Some of the pictures of people look like it is your picture. It's well played.
Okay. First picture, smile everyone. 1, 2, and 3. Okay, that's the first one. Let me go to the second page. And I will ask everybody to smile once again because I am not sure who has rolled over and who hasn't. So 1, 2, and 3. Okay. Thank you very much, everyone. So
Great session.
Thank you. Any more questions before we wrap it up?
I have a question. Sorry, TJ. Omar, do we have the SEU link to drop in the chat for those who are members of Scrum Alliance to get their SEUs?
Yes, ma'am. I am actually, that is the next item on our list. I was waiting for 1 or 2 more questions to post that one.
All right, go ahead, CJ.
Yeah, my last 2 jobs, I've worked in regulated industries. They are for-profit organizations, but when you mentioned adding value, what we were motivated to do was reducing pain points, and so we were already in production. It was in a continuous improvement phase, and there was a roadmap for some mandated features, but as we implemented, there were unanticipated pain points. I wonder if you could give us some tips on managing those with balancing them with planned priorities.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think this is where, you know, you'll hear a lot of people say, like, if you have a lot of unplanned work, do Kanban. If you can plan work, do Scrum. And I think it really comes down to time frame in that model. So You can do a lot of planned product development work in a Kanban system, and you can do unplanned work in a Scrum system, but it really comes down to how you're planning in either model. And so one of the first things I like to look at is how much unplanned work comes in, either on a daily basis or a weekly basis, so that you can start to understand how to allocate slack in your system for that. And slack just means, I mentioned that trap of trying to utilize everyone on the team to 100%. That will always break, because when we start trying to do 100% utilization, right, the actual work is 120%, and then you add in all that unplanned stuff and there's no space to pull that in. And so from a Kanban perspective, I see a lot of security teams that love Kanban because it's unplanned every day. It's a constant fire drill. And so what comes to the top of the queue for the team can change 10 times a day, right? It's always different. That requires a different kind of prioritization method, right? They don't have a product owner, so they need to have really clear criteria around how things get prioritized in their queue. I've even seen teams automate that process so that there's factors that rank things higher and push them to the top. It's not even, there's no human involvement. And from a Scrum perspective, when we think about that planned versus unplanned work, for a lot of teams, like I think what you're describing, some of it's planned, but some of it's unplanned. And so it's like, how do you allocate space in a sprint so that you've got time for unplanned work and that you're still working on planned work at the same time? And that might mean that you look back at past sprints to say, what was the distribution of the work we pulled in for the last 5 sprints? And was it, X number of story points or X number of stories that were planned work, and then all these other tickets that came in that were unplanned? How did that affect what we committed to versus what we delivered? And that starts to give you an idea of what a more appropriate commitment level looks like. It's probably not your full team's velocity. It's probably something much less, so that you have that capacity each sprint to pull in that unplanned work. So again, like past data is your best friend in this. Being able to go back and say, what information do I have about how we've worked before, will help you figure out what the right balance is there of that slack either in your sprint plan or in your Kanban system.
That's great advice. Thank you.
Yeah.
Anybody else have anything else they want to add? Comments? Anything that they thought or that resonated with them from everything that Colleen has and all the knowledge that she has shared with us? Okay. Well, everyone, thank you for coming. We really appreciate it. Thanks to all of you who attended tonight. You made this our biggest session yet. Right now, we actually broke the 50% mark. So thank you everyone for coming. I'm actually really giddy and excited about this. I had to just put it out there. Please, if you can, spread the word about us. Come again. If you want to become a speaker and talk about anything, our doors are open. You can contact me. You can contact Andrea, and we can go ahead and set that up. We meet every last Thursday of the month. And we are really honored and grateful for your attendance. As for our speaker today, Colleen, thank you. This has been a really informative, a really great presentation. We really thank you. Aside from that, like I did mention, Colleen is the CEO of Pro Kanban and has been one of our sponsors. So we're actually grateful to not only have her here, but for also to show her support to our group.
Absolutely.
So thank you everyone for joining us. Please spread the word. Please come back. We promise we'll keep it fun and we'll keep bringing some great talks to your way. So thank you very much. Have a great night and hope to see y'all soon.
Thanks, Omar. Have a great night, everybody.
Have a great night.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye.